Hey, everybody, welcome to the Blind Ambition with Jack Kelly. I'm Rick, and today we have Matt McLarty, who's the Global Field CTO and Vice President of the Digital Transformation Office at MuleSoft. So, what he does is he works directly with leading global companies and provides insights and guidance to the industry. It's really interesting. So, I did some research, Matt. The Transformation Office's mission is to help organizations adopt a composable approach to business that drives innovative customer experiences, automating core processes, plugging into digital ecosystems through APIs and other technologies. This is the first time I've heard of a DTO. Can you explain what that office is? Is it quite unique?
Yeah, sure. No, it's actually a fairly new thing. So first off, MuleSoft, we're really in the guts of companies who are going digital. I would say so. MuleSoft has been around for a while in the industry, leading technology vendor for integration APIs to help companies plug things together, automation, helping automate workflows. So we do also a lot of heavy lifting around the digital space. And so what we found is that a lot of the organizations we're working with historically would be focused on, historically we might be working with IT groups who were, wanting to change the way that they connect systems together, or they have technology initiatives around mobile apps, or, plugging into third-party digital services. But more and more, when we're working with companies, the digital agenda or digital transformation is much higher on the business agenda. It's not just an IT thing anymore. So I'd always been working in my role at MuleSoft with leaders of the companies we're working with, executives, those who are really driving the strategy for their companies. And just because more and more of those leaders were really in a business seat, in addition to those in the IT chair, we just felt like it was really important that we take all the learnings out of the tech space and all the learnings that we had in applying it in a business context and elevate it in a new way for business leaders to really understand what we do. Because even in the explanation I'm giving here, right, it's not necessarily so obvious what role we play. MuleSoft's part of Salesforce, and I think Salesforce is much more easy thing for people to understand when you think about, okay, how do you automate activities for your sales teams? How do you automate marketing activities? How do you provide great customer experiences and e-commerce solutions? Very visceral, user-facing things. Well, underneath all of that, you've got to get to the data. You've got to get to the application functionality. The landscapes of companies these days are these big, complex sprawl of applications and data and technologies, and we really bring that together in a cohesive way. So when you mention the composable thing, what that is really making sense of all that. So if you've got all these complexity, how do you actually show what your company, what's in your company, what are those functions, and what are those pieces of data, so that you can plug and play almost like Lego blocks and create new customer experiences, create new automation. So the digital transformation office, that's what we do. We really work with the business and IT leadership of our customers and help them map what their intentions are around business strategy into the actual execution plan.
That's amazing. Yeah. Now, how did you get there? Because your background, it looks like you kind of went a bunch of different directions. Was it purposeful, or just happenstance, one led to another?
So I have a cousin who, when he was 4 years old, I remember him looking up at a plane in the sky and saying, "I want to be a pilot." And he did his flying hours, and he went to flight school. And today he's actually a pilot here in Vancouver, working for the RCMP, the Mounties, which is like our national police force. He flies a plane. He had his agenda. Me, I don't know. I mean, I went to school. I took math in university because it came naturally to me, and I thought less homework means more time for social activities. As we were discussing before this, I had a dream of becoming a musician. I kind of fell into it. My dad worked in the software industry for years, more on the sales side, and so a friend of his gave me a summer job working at a software vendor in Toronto, Canada. Coming out of university, I got a job at a bank doing entry-level software development. So I've just sort of fumbled my way through. But what's interesting is the stuff I was always attracted to in the industry turns out to have been stuff that was pretty important. So I started my career in the mid 90s. And at that point, I just based on the background I had, I was working on these, what they called tandem computers, nonstop computers, which were a lot of times used to plug different companies together. In my case, it was how do you connect banks to each other so that you can do like credit card transactions across or withdraw money at ATMs. Like that's kind of the space I was in. So I was already in this integration game. And as I worked up through the bank, it was, okay, where else is integration important? And just lo and behold, the World Wide Web became really popular and it offered a whole new opportunity to integrate things. And I kind of graduated into enterprise architecture where we, we're connecting things across the whole bank together as well as outside. And from there, you started introducing new technologies into the bank, which actually made a personal move from Toronto to Vancouver here and switched sides from being in the customer seat to being the software vendor seat. Joined IBM in 2007 to help, again, lead the global practice around their application integration business. And then from there, mobile technology took off, which needed these things called APIs in order to, when you're using your phone and you're using an app, how do you probably know pretty quickly when you don't have network access, right? Because nothing works anymore. Well, the reason nothing works is you can't get access to all those APIs that provide the data and services behind the apps. So that became a big thing. I joined another company, started a group called the API Academy, which was a global practice around how do you design good APIs? How do you launch them as products? And we've seen companies like Twilio and Plaid and others become unicorns just based on API products. And then joined MuleSoft in 2019 to help companies, and MuleSoft being the biggest provider of API services, had such a broad customer base, help them apply these best practices and learn how to use APIs. And so it was definitely an interesting path. I think when you hear the name or the role CTO, right, Chief Technology Officer, it's right there in the name. You think it's all about technology, but I think the reason I'm in this role is more about how do you apply the technology in a business context, which for your listeners who I know are interested in what career aspirations and career goals, having the ability to put technology in a meaningful business context is like, it's a superpower. And it's something where there's incredible technologists out there who can develop and do unbelievable things with software, but being able to straddle between what the business cares about and what is possible with technology is a hugely important skill. That's probably where I've hung my career on that.
That's so interesting. So from a non-technical background, you would hear about, these folks who have these amazing skills and these, great, programs, what have you. But that's good. But it seems like what you're saying in part is like, hey, there's even a better skill, someone who could synthesize all the different moving parts, communicate to the different languages, to the business side, to the tech side, to the marketing side, to the human resource, and distill it all together and make something happen, which is, as you said, like a superpower to do that. So
completely, like, it's amazing to me. I think that like the world of software is all about complexity, right? Like it is, we always think about complexity as, oh, you got to get rid of the complexity. You need to simplify things, make things simple, which is true. We try to do that with technology, but let's face it, like we're always going after complexity because the solutions that we can come up with now where, where you can have robotic interactions with customer service representatives who aren't really customer service representatives, and artificial intelligence and machine learning, all these things. It's just amazing technology that we have out there. But it's interesting how even in the the rooms I'm in, right, how often people can lose sight of the purpose of the technology. There's so much excitement around new technology, and it amazes me how people still don't necessarily ask the question, why, right? Or, why are we doing this? Is this the right thing to do? So, I think there's a lot of talk about innovation, which is, very important, but we have to remember innovation is not invention, right? Innovation is really about applying new technologies in purposeful ways. And so I think that's why having that balance of understanding, why are we doing this? Is it going to be meaningful? How is this adding value for the organization? Um, is really important skill to have. And you can't really do that if you don't understand both sides of the technology as well as the business purpose.
I think what you say about adding value is really interesting, right? Because we have a lot of folks, kind of like you, right? You worked at a bank. You're a bit humble earlier in your introduction. It seemed like you were getting promoted every 2 or 3 years. How did you demonstrate that you added value to such a large organization, one of the top banks in Canada, to be able to have that rapid growth in your career?
I think, looking back at that part of my career, where I was just a young buck, naive, out of school, I have to commend, like, it was actually a very open organization that was really looking at being innovative. I mean, we think of banks, maybe we stereotype them as being being a little stuck in their ways and so on,
right?
and that's that can hold true up here in Canada, where there's big five banks. All the regulations are in place to make things really stable, which is good for our economy. But there, it was a very entrepreneurial environment. So, I mean, they had good mentors, good leadership who could, recognize sort of a hunger. I mean, I think I was just trying to attach myself to the like I said, the stuff that was interesting to me, the new problems to solve were probably also ones that were significant for the business. But even if I look at, from my context, I was learning, oh, what are these new things called web services at that time, which kind of morphed into APIs, right? How could we use that? Oh, this is these new integration appliances that we were introducing, like that was kind of cool. But the fact was, we were solving a big issue for the bank, which was, okay, there's this whole new web channel. We've got online banking was a huge deal. It wasn't so much mobile banking, then it was just getting all the services online, the whole branch revitalization to use new technology. So it just so happened that where we were applying these new technologies was a place that was unlocking a lot of value for the bank overall, and was very much high on the business agenda there as well. So I think that, just in terms of where I've been operating and like I said, in the guts of the organization, usually you may not be getting the headlines there, but you're usually moving some big boulders that can be in the way of things, and they become sort of foundational changes. And that's why this composable approach we talked about earlier is really about moving those boulders and keeping them out of the way. And it's if you look at the trajectory of my career, it looks like it was sort of planned because it's followed all these industry trends, but really it was, I would say that, and this is kind of the way the digital space works as well. If you want to look really smart, be really quick to react, be really agile to react to changing market dynamics, because that's we can't predict the future. Like you go back 3 years, right? How many companies were planning on their pandemic measures, right? But the companies that I think have done best, and the individuals have done best, are the ones that adapt as quickly as possible to the changing dynamics. So probably a little bit of that in there as well.
Do you
Do you
have
think
any
there's I'm sorry, go ahead, Ray.
sorry, do you have any advice for a technologist or an engineer of how to adapt and have that foresight and demonstrate that ability?
Yeah, I think for engineers, I think there's a real balancing act, because what you'll find is that there's some being really good at a particular technology can be lucrative, right? I mean, we can look at new examples of like, okay, Rust languages and Go and, GraphQL and like all these sort of new and interesting technologies. People are looking for those skills. You can make money. Actually, I started my career, some of the code I was writing was in COBOL, mainframe language, right? You can make a lot of money as a COBOL developer in 2022 because
No one, right?
because
No one knows it.
the skill set is aging out. But I'm a little more biased to say, don't hang your hat on particular technologies because my God, they just come and go, right? You don't know which horse to bet on. To me, again, really learning the applicability of the technologies you're working on, having business domain knowledge too is just as important, and I would say more long lasting, right? If I really understand the telco industry and understand how companies operate and make money and where the technology fits into all that, right? We're always going to need these industry capabilities and being able to actually learn how technologies evolve in a particular business domain and how to introduce new technologies. That type of skill that you may not be thinking about is really, really valuable, and much more long lasting, as I said.
So that opens up a couple of things. One, I wonder, is there also a little bit of luck involved? Is that with the trajectory of technology, if you are kind of smart enough, fortunate enough to be at the right place at the right time, the rising tide lifts all boats. So then you put yourself in a great spot. But then it sounds like, Matt, the next step is to have to use your words, like a superpower, to look around corners as well, to say, okay, I'm doing really well being a coder, being a software developer, being an engineer, but I feel the winds are changing and I can keep doing what I'm doing, but I might be left behind. So kind of know when to say, let me put the brakes on and now pivot to something else. And you could be right, you could be wrong. But if you're right, then you kind of catch that next wave and so on and so on.
Yeah, I would say constantly challenging your own sort of stepping outside of your own paradigm, let's say, is a really important thing to do. That's what I think looking around corners is a good way of looking at that, where it's easy to get, there's all sorts of communities in like I love tech because it's a very social, I think sometimes we think about software engineers as being antisocial people in the basement on their own writing code, right? It's actually a very social field to be in, right? And so it's so important, especially with all the complexity involved, that we get diversity of opinions, and but you can still, there's bubbles, so you can get stuck in one of those bubbles and feel like this is like what I'm involved in right now is the most important thing, it's the highest growth thing, but there's lots of bubbles out there. So I've had experiences like that in my career where about 8 years ago now, I think there was this explosion of interest in something called microservices and microservice architecture. It was like the revolutionary approach to software architecture. And at the time, having lived through the 10 years earlier, the big, what we called service-oriented architecture boom, my initial reaction was a bit of scorn of saying, like, this is just SOA all over again. Like why, why are people, haven't they heard of this before? Scoffing at it like grumpy old man a little bit. Then I challenged myself to say, clear your mind, beginner's mind. Let's go and just see what this is all about. And again, not looking at the how, but looking more at the why. And there were new problems and new approaches, and kind of opened my mind. So I agree. I think that the time when things are the best, that you feel like you're in exactly the right spot, and are probably the times where you want to push yourself a little bit to get out and see what's coming next. What are the challenges? Because the one thing we do know is whatever you're working on today from a technology perspective will be passé and at most 3 years.
Speaking of that, is there a theory to do this, to get to a certain point where you're great at what you do you're a great, let's say, software designer, developer, what have you, but you hit a certain age, and maybe it's not so much the age, but you realize, can I keep up with this? Can I keep this going? Or am I better pivoting to do what what you're talking about, be kind of this big picture person who could put all the pieces together and know when to say, is this, should I just leave this stuff to the 20, 30-year-olds? And maybe I'm better off now doing this instead of just keep riding that horse. And maybe that's not the right horse to be on. I got to get off. Is that something people have to consider too?
They could. I mean, I don't think you have to, though. I mean, I work with tremendous engineers of all ages. I work with some people who are really good at straddling the business technology line, who are younger and earlier in their careers. But I just think that practice of constantly sort of reminding yourself to keep yourself open to options, right? To think about, finding the match between what the industry needs and what you're interested in doing and what you're good at, like all that stuff, I think is something that you want to keep evaluating, because in spite of the economy, wherever it is, whether it's supercharged or whether it's downturned, so on, like the growth of business is in the digital space. The growth of business is in the software space, and so there's still going to be lots of opportunities to find out there in either of those fields.
So and the reason I brought it up, because, to be transparent, I've been running a search firm for now 25 years, and I'm exhausted. And I'll be very upfront. I am shot. I am so burnt out and so shot and so tired, because I'm a better recruiter than manager. So I spend more time recruiting, dealing with clients, because I enjoy that better than the managerial part. But I could feel I don't know how long I could keep going at that pace without just crashing. And that's one of the reasons why I started, and just as a kind of happenstance, I started writing for Forbes, doing podcasts. And I realized, wait, that maybe, there's a second act, where I'm still at age to say, hey, I don't know. So I was applying what I'm thinking to tech, but maybe it's a completely different world where there's kind of a built-in obsolescence where you may not have that stamina ability to keep doing it, but take the skills that you have and transfer it somewhere else, where then you could have a second act and then a third act and a fourth act.
Yeah, you absolutely can. I mean, hey, I'm in my mind, I'm going to be a professional musician full-time one day still, right? Like, don't give up the dreams. No, in it all, I've definitely seen people make pivots like that. And I think that having those exploring sidelines, like sharing the learning, is energizing. And so I would say that as well for engineers that are out there. The more you can blog, the more you can contribute to open source, the more you can, be on podcasts or do this type of thing, conference talks, like that can open doors, but it can also just be energizing. I mean, there's a thread in probably, I would say, the past 15 years of my career since I joined software vendor companies, that I've just been helping companies with their strategy around IT. And some days I'm like, are we really still having this problem? Like, this is the same thing 15 years ago they had. And so you have days like that, but then you'll talk to companies and you'll say like, aha, look at what they're doing. Like, they're doing all the stuff that we've been wanting people to do for so long. So, diversifying, and maybe I'm biased now because I've been studying this concept of optionality a lot, because it's actually inherent. When I talk about composable approach, optionality is like I think it's started as an economic theory, but it's being really studied in a technology context now of, the value of having choices, right? How do you actually quantify having choices? It's a big deal when it comes to what we do, because if we go into a company and we say, take all of your locked away application assets or data and turn them into composable digital business capabilities that can be used in different channels, different contexts, all of a sudden we've unlocked this optionality value. right? Because now it's, you may have solved your current problem, but you've done it in a way that opens up 100 possibilities for the future. So I kind of look at that as looking at everything through this optionality lens now. So from a career perspective, right, the more you dip your toe into these different areas, then you're definitely opening up options for the future. I know, like, for example, one of the most popular software engineering podcasts is SE Daily, Software Engineering Daily. I know that the guy who started that was a full-time engineer and just started a podcast as a sideline, and now he's built up this big full-time podcasting.
All right, Rick, we're gunning for that guy, I guess. Is that it?
Yeah. Jeff Myers. And anyway, I'll look it up and send to you guys after.
I mean, was this concept of optionality something that you discovered more recently, or was this something that has always been a common trend line, even in your early days of your career?
I think it's one of those implicit things where you don't know what it is, but we didn't have a name for it really. Where we talked a lot about, reusability and stuff. But it was interesting is it was actually Gene Kim, who's the author of the Phoenix Project, very big. He runs the DevOps Enterprise. He has a publishing company, IT Revolution. He has a podcast series called Idealcast, and he was talking about this idea of optionality. Actually, it dovetails with APIs, because the big optionality story is really Amazon and how they sort of had this edict in 20 years ago, 2002, that said, we're going to build everything we do behind APIs, because they didn't put it in these terms, but essentially that will provide all this optionality. And as a result, that's where Amazon Web Services as a cloud computing platform really came from, because they had unbundled and created all these API enabled components that were then used to build up this new commercial offering. But I digress. But but on Gene's podcast, he was talking about a professor at Harvard Business School, Dr. Carlos Baldwin, and she'd done a lot of work. She actually started in the economic space and then moved into the studying technology companies and realizing that software is inherently full of optionality if you build it in the right way, and was illustrating, like, if you were to build a piece of technology this way that had no optionality, the value is much less than if you were to actually break it apart into these modular pieces, which would be connect with each other through APIs. Then you've got all this optionality, and she actually has like some real graduate level statistical approaches to measuring the value of it. But I find it very interesting. I think that it's anyone who's worked in software, there's sort of a just an implicit understanding that, okay, that makes sense, but now I can actually quantify why it makes sense.
You could apply that in any field, it seems like. It's having a skill stack where maybe you're good at marketing, but then also you teach yourself or become a good writer, and then maybe you learn some other talent. So all of a sudden that gives you optionality to say, oh, maybe I could kind of pivot to different things now because I'm not one dimensional. Rick writes about sports, so he can maybe one day be a sports writer, right. So it gives you
Jack,
yeah.
Jack, you got the composable approach to life there, right? It's like, what are these components that we can put together in these different contexts? And that's exactly it. We talk sort of about decomposition as a way of enabling optionality and composition. And so, I actually did a blog in the fall talking about automation, and actually used the music recording landscape to illustrate as an analogy to what companies are able to do now, where it used to be that to record, look at us here, right, on a software platform with our digital devices. But it used to be that you get studio time in a mahogany paneled studio. I was actually mentioned, I think, Fleetwood Mac, when they recorded the Rumors album back in 1977. They had the mixing board they had was it was an API brand mixing board, nothing to do with APIs now. That was my hook. But you'd have this big monolithic studio, and you'd have to book time and go in, and it was just reel to reel tape. And but now everything is these little digital components, right down to plugging in effects on mixing software. So completely different ball game, right? Completely democratizes it so that we've got much more accessibility. But you're right. From a personal level, you're thinking about where you add value in aggregate, but also in these composable chunks. Then you can start to look at what are the fields that are open to you, what are the new roles that are open to you.
Gosh, I mean, in terms of just advancing your career, there's this tendency to kind of optimize for levels or compensation because it's a very clear hierarchy. But it seems like your approach is again about like skills and growth, and again providing that adaptation, that optionality. How would you balance, or what would be your advice on how to kind of navigate, whether through your own experience or just knowing from what you know now?
Yeah, I think that we have to first of all sort of acknowledge our privilege in the tech space, right? Which is we're in my wife works in she's a social worker, and she works in an environment where most funding is public funding, and it's just so constrained. And so I always, start with, before we all start complaining and whining and stuff, let's acknowledge that being in the tech space is an extremely privileged place to be, and the opportunities here, it's great. In that context, I think that there are real constraints of companies. And I think that one of the things I'm working with companies on, it's not just about their technology strategy, but their organizational strategy. Because the other thing that we've noticed with this, I'm talking about composability from sort of a software architecture angle, but it applies to organizations as well. I don't know if anyone on the podcast has heard of Conway's Law. It's a big deal in software architecture circles. There's an incredibly brilliant man named Mel Conway who's still active in the field. I've met him. He's just so smart. He's worked at Apple. He worked at Xerox PARC Lab. Like he's been all over the place. But he wrote a paper in 1967 or 68. I think it was published in 68, called, I think, How Committees Invent. And what came out of that was this statement that what we build essentially mimics the structure of the organization that built it, right? And this is something we see all the time in the software space, where, if your organization is designed in a certain way, then there's no way around the fact that your software systems are going to look like that organization, right? Or the way that the organization communicates. So if there's 5 teams building a project, building on a project, then you're going to end up with 5 components. It's just kind of the way things go. But the reason I brought that up is just, I think that organizations need to evolve as well. And we are seeing now where companies are starting to understand this now, that this strict hierarchy that sort of worked, or maybe worked in more of a static, like manufacturing context, 20th century manufacturing, mass distribution, one way, parts go in, products come out, that type of approach. Maybe that organizational structure worked in that environment, but in the digital space, where everything's changing all the time, all the communication is bi-directional. When you release a product, the customer expects it's going to get better over time because it's software based and you can push updates to it all the time, right? In that environment, we need a different sort of structure for organizations. But so we have to accept, though, that there's still constraints within organizations, and there still are, it always kills me if I see someone who's a really good individual contributor who takes a management position just because they want to advance their career, even though that's not what their interests lie.
Right.
So I think the industry is getting better at finding more career paths. And I think some of the bigger software companies have led the way here in pushing career paths around distinguished engineers and, lots more fields for people to advance their careers. So I would say, you have to be mindful and work within the constraints of your organization, but don't assume the only way forward is to take that management job, or, or to just push hard for, that promotion is the only way. Like, I think bigger companies are also getting better at finding lateral opportunities for people to move around and seeing the value in that too. I know, Jack, when we talked the piece you did last time, we were talking a lot about this developer attrition or the great resignation
Yes.
problem that's going on. I mean,
Right.
people want to move. It can be good to make moves. And if you're a big company, right, rather than, risk people just walking out the door, I think even if people are extremely valuable in their positions they're in now, you'd rather have them move to another part of your organization than you would have them walk out the door from your company. So I think, if you're in a bigger company, one of the advantages there is there's probably lots more places to move around as well. So I would say there's lots more roles out there, and so don't feel that the only way forward is to step out of doing what you're doing today. There's probably other roles where you can be great at what you're doing today, bring the new skills in, and find other roles.
I'm so glad you brought this on, Matt, because whether it's tech or any other sector, there's this feeling, this almost societal pressure that you're at a certain level, and then, okay, the next step is you have to be a manager. And then you have to manage 5 people, and then you have to manage 10 people. And even if you don't like being a manager, you just feel, oh, that's what I'm supposed to do, which is the craziest thing ever, because the skills that may make you fantastic, whether it's a software designer or it could be a lawyer, may not translate. Same thing in sports. How many times do you see in sports, we have this great player, any sport, soccer, baseball, football, and then they're kind of the end of their career and they're going to go into coaching, and they put them into coaching or in a management spot, and they're terrible because they were great. They're a great baseball player. They were fantastic. They were amazing. They were an all-star. But that doesn't mean you can be a good manager of people. They're too complete. And we pretend like, oh, okay, because you're a great all-star, now you can be a great manager. They're completely different skill sets.
Completely.
And,
yeah.
And it doesn't work, and it leads to frustration.
It's like they expect, I think, when like Wayne Gretzky, I'm Canadian, right? So I'm a hockey guy. And Wayne Gretzky became coach in Phoenix. He didn't have a lot of success. He probably expected everyone to play like Wayne Gretzky on his team, right? Like
exactly. Why are you playing like me? Like,
yeah.
How come you're not doing this?
I think sports is a good analogy for tech, though, because like it or not, you'll see in sports, if you get a coach, most coaches are ex-players, even if they only played in the minor leagues, because a credibility issue, right? It's very rare that you would see, maybe some general managers may come in, Moneyball, Revolution, all that. You may see them come in, but for the most part, athletes want to be led by people who've lived in their shoes. It's the same in tech. I've found that credibility is a huge concern when it comes to leadership in tech. And so people want to know that their boss can empathize with them because they've walked in their shoes. But you're completely right. Like, the people that are, what makes you a great technologist doesn't make you a great manager. And I also, though, like, sympathize. I'm in a management role. I have a small team of superstars, so I don't want to I've got it easy. But it's hard to be a manager these days too. That's the other thing. Like, because again, living in all the complexity that we deal with in the technology landscape, we've got all that organizational complexity and everything going on. So yeah, if you're going to become a manager, you should do it because you love being a manager. And maybe, I find that I probably rely much more on my parenting skills than my tech skills when it comes to pure management stuff. And I'm not doing that to in my career, I would say that's true. And I probably learned from management and applying to parenting as well. That's not to belittle
people. No, it's very fair.
People in the teams myself, to say,
absolutely.
You don't want to belittle. You're not saying they're like kids or anything like that, but just that understanding that you can't give instructions to a machine when you're coding, and it will follow the instructions, right? When you're dealing with people, it's just completely you have to take the farmer's mentality, right? You create the conditions so that the plants will grow. So anyway, that's probably a whole other podcast.
Now I hope this comes out in the right way, because what I've noticed, a lot of women leaders are great if they have children, they're used to carrying out having a kid on one arm, a kid on the other arm, juggling this, juggling the schedules, and they can become great managers because they're so used to, managing, their spouse, their partner, their kids, the travel itinerary, everything. And where guys are like, all right, I just packed my t-shirt, I'm ready to go.
Yeah, I think that's, I think that I would like to think that it's more a reflection of just men need to be more involved in that at home anyway,
Yeah.
right? So if they're not, then that's a problem. But I've seen, I think that's definitely improved. But yeah, it's a very different skill set. And I mean, and I don't want to discourage anyone from getting into management, right? Because it's so important, and it's, as things get more complex, it's even more important. But just get into it because you're interested in becoming a great manager, not because you want to jump a level on the ladder at your company.
I wonder too, do you have it at MuleSoft or Salesforce where some companies will give the upskilling and training and coaching to be a better manager because they're understanding, like what we were talking about, that it may not come intuitively to them to be a good, empathetic manager. So, but like anything in life, you get some coaching, some training, some guidance, some mentoring, then you can evolve into that role and be good at it.
Yeah, Salesforce is phenomenal. It's a phenomenal company in terms of there's a whole great leaders track, community, everything that's it's extremely robust, all sorts of learning, all sorts of support. So yeah, it's definitely, I mean, I had been a manager in my career prior to joining, but I've learned a lot even through the resources that we have here.
It's interesting. We talked, it seems, even though we're kind of past the pandemic, you still have that pandemic wooziness, like, lose track of time. But we're kind of talking about a survey that you had from MuleSoft, how to prevent developers from getting burnt out and how to make them happier. And then in just a short time in between, we had downsizings in tech, hiring freezes, stock market not doing too well, kind of a bear market in tech. What do you see now? I mean, through that lens now, do you think, like, how are they still burnt out? Are they happy? Are they just happy to have a job? Is there another level of stress now because there are downsizings? What's the temperature of the room?
Yeah, I think, like, let's be honest about these roaring 20s that we're in, this decade that we're in, right? Which started with the pandemic. And yeah, I mean, depending on where you are in the world and what your criteria are, we're either post-pandemic or still in the pandemic. And if obviously the after effects of the pandemic hitting are going to be felt for a long time, I think even psychologically. So if you turn on the news, you're going to be affected, right? And I think that we're all as humans affected every day by all sorts of things that we're hearing, right? Economically, it's a tight spot now. I mean, there's sort of geopolitical landscape and the economics, you can never be detangled, and so we're there. I think that there's a possible tendency for overreaction in these circumstances. Like, and this is where big company reactions can be, we got to stop everything as a big company, because it's again, that management lens. How do you look at things on a case by case basis? So there's definitely more noise going on out there. But like I said earlier, like, I think that, when companies are in a boom economy, what do they want to do right now? Well, they want to be more digital. They want to take more advantage of these new technologies. Well, when companies are in a downturn market, what do they want to do? Well, they want to save costs and be more efficient. And what do they need to do that? Well, they need more technology. They need more automation. They need more, to squeeze more out of the fruits that they have. So no matter which way you slice it, the investment that's there and how big it is will depend, but the investment that's there is going to be aimed at digital technologies. So I think it's still a very good space to be in. And I think that, for anyone in the market, you'll see that there's still lots of opportunities there, and it's the best place to be.
Rick, what are you hearing on Blind? Are people getting worried, a little panicking, or that, hey, we've been through this before, we just kind of will get through it again?
Yeah, so the blind community, they're nervous, right? Because they're seeing big names that we've all heard of, Meta, Microsoft freezing hiring on teams, and it seems to contradict to the kind of innate understanding of, oh, well, the world is digitizing. There's always going to be a need for engineers and technologists, and we're seeing some members of our community kind of struggle with this kind of contradiction, and it it might not be a contradiction at all, right? Because it is true, like the world is digitizing. There is still a need for um technologists and great developers, and I think you're seeing some of the we're certainly seeing some of the older more tenured members of our community come in and say, hey, don't worry, you know, exactly like Matt said, right? Like it's very important that you optimize on growth. Don't focus so much on the compensation. A lot of these technologists get paid in stock-based compensation, right? And so they're saying their stock drop and freaking out a little bit about that. But it's really about the long-term picture, right?
Yeah. Well, the other thing to consider, I think, Jack, we talked about this as well when we were talking on the last piece there, is that we think about Meta and Microsoft and Google and other, these Amazon big companies as being the main place for jobs in tech. But they are, like, they're really significant. But also, like, every company is hiring software, or every
Right.
company needs software engineers, right? Every industry, they're all hiring. Like the list of companies I've talked to in the last month spans from government to healthcare to banking to telecommunications to retail, like all of that. They're all software jobs are needed everywhere. And so, um, would I expect companies like Meta and Microsoft to be in hiring pause or hiring freeze for 2 years? No, not even a year, probably not either, right? Like, I think this is
Right.
very much a very temporary wait and see thing. So, but again, just a reminder to everyone that there's needs for software developers across every industry.
And because there are big needs, and I agree with you, I think, well, it's one of these things. It's a correction, where economy always has that. You have the dot-com boom and bust. You have the financial
Right.
crisis. Boom and bust, and so forth. So it's just part of the capitalist cycle of things happening, and eventually we'll go through it. And in a way, it's good because you let the air out of the balloon, comes down a little bit. The PE ratios for stock become more reasonable, and then kind of slowly build up again. But in the meantime, as there's a demand, as you pointed out, across the board, not just in the tech space, but every kind of company. Because, like, what do they say? Like, every company's a tech company now, is what they throw out, right?
Exactly.
Like,
Yeah.
everyone is. So what does it take to make them happy, keep them engaged, keep them at the company? How to attract them, and how do you keep them from getting burnt out?
Yeah, I think that there's a few things there. Like, number one, even just thinking about what is the experience for developers at your organization. So if you're a leader at a company where you're employing software engineers, what does a day in the life of your engineers look like? Like, how many mandatory training courses do they have to go through? What is the process? How long does it take them to from the time they write a piece of code to the time it actually gets deployed and used? Like, looking at some of these processes of how much time are they doing the stuff they enjoy versus, and that they view as being valuable and productive work, versus stuff that maybe they view as menial tasks. And I think that a lot of organizations, especially big ones, can be sort of over standardized and taking away freedom, putting on too many constraints on developers. So that's one. And I think that, looking at the tool chain, tool opportunity, tools, processes they have to go through, how many manual steps they have to take that over and over again. So, how much you can automate their experience in a positive way. Even just thinking about developer experience, I think is really good. We some of the stuff that we had in our survey was around like the complexity of the architecture there. So again, I'm obviously going to be saying this composable approach actually makes developers happy because they can understand what their landscape looks like, right? I think I mentioned the social aspect of development too, right? I think that there's this really interesting contradiction in some of the feedback that comes out of developers. You'll see memes around that meeting could have been an email. So, or also, but at the same time, they are social. So really looking at, how much time are people being forced into like just status meetings where they feel like it's repetition of things. And, but that again, I think goes back to this whole idea of developer experience. I think that, so here's something really interesting that happened at MuleSoft is we're navigating a very complex, deep in the tech stack space, right? As I described earlier. And our developers, one thing there was an initiative actually came out of our engineering and product organization where they said, you know what, we want to really define, this is what we're doing. This is the mission we're on as a company for our customers. In order to illustrate to everybody in the engineering organization, this is where your piece of work is going to contribute to that mission. So they actually did work, they call it this North Star initiative, to say, here's our North Star that we're all aiming for, and here's where your work is contributing to that and why it matters. I think that when developers have a sense of knowing that what they're working on is meaningful and valuable, that's inspiring for them. I think that outcome focus, as opposed to, maybe they're working on some new hipster technology, but they're like, what's the point? So, and again, it also gets them in that good mindset of thinking business outcomes first and understanding the value contribution. So that's another thing. But those are just some general thoughts. I think if there's the one main thing though is to really empathize with those developers and think, what does a day in the life look like for the developer? What's their experience and how much of their time are they doing the stuff that's valuable and the stuff that is what they enjoy doing?
Got it. I love that lesson. Focus on what you enjoy doing. Thanks so much, Matt, for coming on the show.
Yeah,
that's a good way. That's that, right. That was a good way to kind of wrap it up. So Matt, that was awesome. That's awesome. I really appreciate you taking the time and discussing. And it's so interesting. So as someone who's outside this world, it's great to get a glimpse of it. But I think it applies not just to the tech folks. I think it applies across the board. A lot of the lessons that you were kind of setting forth in the advice and guidance really crosses over.
Oh, that's exactly right.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I don't come. I try and approach work like you approach life, right?
Yeah. Because that happens in every kind of business. It's like you do work and you're like, why am I doing this? Where is it pushing the needle? Is it doing anything? Is this just busy work? You're just dumping this on me. I don't see any end game. And you get frustrated, you get burnt out because you're like, I'm just spinning my wheels here. And it could be, any profession you go through that. But if you have good managers, you could say, okay, like you said, I like the North Star, kind of approach. Hey, here's what we're shooting for. And here's, Rick, this is what your piece is. Jack, here's what your piece is. This is, and Matt, here's what you're contributing. And you're like, oh, now I feel empowered. I'm responsible for this. And then I can see if I do my job correctly, here's what the end goal is going to be. Oh, fantastic.
Yeah. I think management, I think this might have been in a Netflix, one of their Netflix engineering principles documents or something, like talking about what is management these days. And it's a lot of it is about context and communication. Yeah. Right. And I think I try and take that approach too, right? I'm going to ask you to do something. Why am I asking you to do this? Right. And where your part matters. People can figure it out for themselves sometimes, but it really helps if they're getting that message from above to say, what you're doing matters. And it doesn't happen as often as it should.
Right.
Hey, before we leave, you have a conference, so maybe we could kind of, Rick and I could give a little shout out on social media to give a little
Yeah.
attention to it. When is it? What's it about?
Yeah, every year we do what we call our Connect conference for MuleSoft, where we bring together thought leaders. Uh, I think Adam Grant is going to be the keynote, one of the keynotes at this year's conference in New York. We're actually doing 4 cities in a 24-hour span, so we're blanketing the globe. I'll be in New York City on June 29th at our Connect event, and doing a panel talk as well as meeting with customers. So it's just a great place to learn from other companies that are really being innovative and using this composable approach we've been talking about. Um, they have a lot of lessons learned, good and bad, things to do, things to avoid on the digital transformation journey. And so, like I said, that's June 29th in New York City.